Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Riley Black, author of The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, An Asteroid, Extinction, and the Beginning of Our World, published by St. Martin's Press. It'll be released on April 26th. Riley is the author of a lot of them, Written in Stone, My Beloved Brontosaurus. Mine was too when I was little. When Dinosaurs Ruled, for National Geographic, Prehistoric Predators, Skeleton Keys, Deep Time, and a kid's book, Did You See That Dinosaur? So I guess you get the picture, and Riley and I were just talking about it, that she's kind of obsessed with dinosaurs, as most kids are, and we can discuss the reasons for that. But she's grown up and still finds them as wonderful and is just as curious about them as new species are unearthed every month or so. So The Last Days relives for us the story of the great Impactor, meandering about in the outer half of the asteroid belt, and then casually, 66 million years ago, or thereabouts, decided that it's going to pay us a visit. All 6 miles of it, it struck us at a convenient for it 30 to 45 degree angle, right in the gut of the Yucatan Peninsula, all 2 trillion metric tons of it, and wiped out in minutes pretty much of all non-avian. And we can talk about that nomenclature as well. And this is the end of the Cretaceous. I'm going to pronounce everything wrong. The third and final period of the Mesozoic era, and the longest at 79 million years, and preceded by the Jurassic. Oh, and Riley is the consultant on the Jurassic Park movies as well, and the Triassic. And that's just a part of the history of the sauropods. But the coolest thing about the book is, in the hottest way possible, is that Riley takes us back to the moment of impact, of enormous impact, which is amazing, as if we were there. And then we follow her through hell, so to speak, to a week later, a month later, years and years later, until we finally reach a point where we can see the beginning of us. So welcome, Riley, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. And I'm glad you liked the book. Like you said, it's really this story of unfolding that's kind of not been told before. So I really have enjoyed taking this event that might seem familiar and really unpacking it.
You know, it's funny because, Ray Bradbury is like, when I was a kid, Ray Bradbury, Robert Heinlein, and you talk about The Sound of Thunder, and that's how kind of what you did. I mean, when they're walking along that pathway and he steps off, it just reminded me so much of that story, the way you undertook the idea of us being right there.
Oh, I mean, that's high praise. I'm a Bradbury fan myself. So that's really what I was kind of going for, to try and put people back in that time period. And it's also relevant, maybe this is jumping ahead slightly, but I often get asked about this extinction, if it had never transpired, if that asteroid had either missed us or hit in a different place, or something about the extinction had changed, would we still be here? And the fact is probably not. Much like the butterfly effect that's named after that story, this is our own version of the butterfly effect, where if that extinction had been canceled or altered in some way, there's no assurance that humans would have appeared, that our own history would have been unmodified. It would have been dramatically altered by the continued survival of some of our favorite dinosaurs and the other creatures that were living on the planet at the time. So this really is one of the few times in the history of life on Earth that you can pinpoint a particular day. Really, even if we don't have the exact date on the calendar, we know that this transpired so quickly that the world was one way the day before, and the next it was fundamentally different, and kind of going down this alternate pathway. So it really is a powerful example of that concept that Bradbury wrote about in The Sound of Thunder.
So going off of one of my, you'll probably find out, irrelevant pathways, segues, I was thinking when I reread Sound of Thunder last night, and I was thinking, geez, it's exactly like what's happening now. Deutscher getting to be president instead of the other nice guy. And it's like our world now, right? It's all screwed up.
Well, even beyond, those things now, I think we're all familiar with it in one way or another, that, there was maybe a job interview that we were late for. And if we hadn't been late, we would have had that job and kind of gone on a different pathway. Even something as simple as like, I shouldn't have had that chili dog for lunch, and kind of ruined the rest of my day. You know, in large terms or small terms, like the choices that we make, it opens and closes all these different pathways. We don't live in a universe where everything imaginable is possible at any given moment. There's this aspect of what Stephen Jay Gould called contingency in many of his books about paleontology, that at any given moment of time, the next step that you're able to take, or this pathway that you're able to go down, may be more open or closed, or have certain challenges or complications based upon where you're starting at now. And this really is one of these events in Earth's history. When we look at other mass extinctions, they take place over hundreds of thousands of years, so these prolonged time frames, sometimes maybe 1,000,000 years apart between the beginning and the end of it. And this was a matter of the main pulse happening in about 24 hours, followed by about 3 years. So that is incredibly short. You know, you go to high school and graduate in a longer amount of time that it took this extinction to transpire.
Yeah, I guess we should go back for everybody and for neophytes especially. So let's set the stage. Where are we in time? What preceded the impact time-wise? Who was hanging around? And why it's called the KT or the KPG extinction, and what came after. So let's just set the stage for that so everyone gets an idea.
Right. So, you know, we all know, obviously, because they're not around, there's not a Triceratops wandering past my window right now, that we're in a world without the non-avian dinosaurs, that this mass extinction occurred, and it occurred about 66 million years ago. That's been dated relatively well. I think it was recently revised, maybe about 15 or so years ago. We used to say 65, now it seems more close to 66. So it's like the very, very end of the Cretaceous period, the very end of what we think of popularly as the age of reptiles. And in telling this story, it's the story of a global event. It's a story of an event that changes our planet and life on Earth fundamentally. But we only have a few windows in time to really look at what happened. This goes back to concepts in the 19th century about geology, that if you think of the geological record as a book, which is really nice to do because rock layers are kind of like pages. When I go through slot canyons, I can see all the layers. Sometimes I think I'm walking through a great geologic book. But in that book, you're missing a number of pages. And on those pages, you're missing a number of paragraphs and sentences and punctuation marks. So we're really trying to understand a narrative from all these chunks and bits and pieces. But in the case of the last days of the Cretaceous and what transpired after, one of our best windows on the planet comes from the Hell Creek Formation. So this rock unit that's about 2 million years worth of rocks that were laid down along this ancient floodplain environment that's exposed in eastern Montana and the western Dakotas. There are some time equivalent places in places like Alberta and Wyoming, but Hell Creek is primarily in that pocket of Montana and the Dakotas. And that's really important because we have the end of the Cretaceous period. So the rock layers are leading up to the impact. And then we have rock layers from the 1,000,000 or so years after it. And that's really important because then we can get a sense of, okay, who was there before and who was there after, who survived, who went extinct, who might have moved somewhere else. If you only have leading up to the impact, you can't really tell who went extinct because there's no after. And if you have the after part, it's the same problem. So the Hell Creek Formation is one of the few places in the world that we really have these very abundant, wonderful exposures that allow us to replay this story. The search is going on elsewhere on the planet for similar rock units, but that's what's really important about this. It's like kind of a sandwich in time, that you have the Cretaceous, you have the impact layer that's very well defined, and then you have the time period that came after, the Paleocene. And the reason we used to call it the KT and now it's called the KPG is just geological nomenclature. We used to use the term tertiary for the time period that came after the age of reptiles, which was technically called the secondary, but we got rid of that naming system. So the time period that comes directly after the Cretaceous is called the Paleogene. So that's why we changed it to KPG these days. But that's the importance of that area, is that basically this boundary layer that you can find at many places across the planet kind of marks the impact that's tied very closely to it. This isn't saying, okay, well, we have these ash beds and how long would it take for them to be laid down? Maybe this was tens of thousands of years before, whatever it is. This is very immediate. It's something that you can basically see the change, not in real time, but a very defined amount of time between these two rock layers.
You talk about proximate and ultimate causation. So let's just go directly to the impactor, because, even though it caused a horrible thing, it's the coolest thing too. We don't want it to happen again, but your description is great. You can go to YouTube and watch, great videos of it. But talk about what it was, where it came from, how big it was, the power it had, all that stuff.
Yeah, so we don't have really there's no chunk of rock that's left from the impactor in the crater. It was so utterly pulverized that we have bits and pieces spread around the planet. But based upon geological analysis and sort of working backwards, it's kind of like starting from a crime scene and trying to figure out what transpired there. It's kind of paleontological CSI on a grand scale. It's estimated that this chunk of rock was probably a carbonaceous chondrite, so it's a particular kind of asteroid that's tied to sort of the early formation of planets. It seemed to be a bit of debris that was left over from the formation of our solar system that just didn't get taken up in anything else. It's just kind of hanging out in this belt called the Oort cloud that's around the edges of our solar system, until it kind of got nudged a little bit into sort of gravitational pull. It starts getting pulled, the hypothesis goes, between the space between the sun and Jupiter, more or less. And even though we're talking about the expanses of millions of miles, and it might not seem particularly close at all, there's still enough gravitational force that this large chunk of rock starts getting pulled closer and closer into our solar system. And this is all taking place perhaps before dinosaurs even existed. So it's strange to think about this, that we have an event 66 million years ago, but it's not as if this asteroid was just hanging out in the neighborhood and dropped by. This is something that was really a 1 in a billion kind of shot, that you have this chunk of rock that's on the outer edges of the solar system gradually getting pulled in. Gravitational forces similar to what happened with Shoemaker-Levy 9, this particular extraterrestrial body that struck Jupiter. It's getting close and it's getting pulled, and it's kind of like a slingshot effect, where it was slingshot further into our solar system towards Earth. So if you think about all these things, if that asteroid had been moving a little bit slower, if it had been smaller, if the Earth had been rotating faster or moving faster in its orbit, or was in a different place, so many small variables, you can make a tiny adjustment, something very different would happen. So this really is the worst possible outcome at so many different stages over the course of hundreds of millions of years. So during the entire basically reign of the dinosaurs, if we want to call it that, from the time that they originated, diversified, came in all the wonderful shapes and sizes and colors that we love, there was something coming for them, even then, that they couldn't have possibly known about just by chance. And it happened to strike 66 million years ago. So it was something where it could have just as easily missed. And there are lots of near Earth orbit objects that miss us today. But this just happened to be the worst circumstance out of all of them.
It's funny, we're talking about, your love for these guys, and T-Rex, you love talking about T-Rex, and it's like, okay, well, if it didn't happen, these guys are really clunky, they're really slow, they're really dumb. What's that formula about surface area and volume? There's some kind of formula about as surface area increases. I forgot.
Yeah,
anyway.
the ratio changes, that as you get larger, your surface area gets smaller compared to the volume inside. That's why it will take like a lot longer to cook a turkey in the oven than a smaller chicken.
Well, yeah. So where were they going to go? I mean, their brain. Do you think that there was any consciousness, any self-awareness that they had of their own existence? You talk about it a little bit in terms of wanting something or needing something.
Yeah, I think they had drives similar to many organisms today. That's the thing that's very difficult to put our minds into what an animal knows. When we look at, I drew a lot of inspiration for this book in terms of behavior from modern equivalents or modern relatives that we know today. Many birds are incredibly smart, and that's a relatively recent phenomenon. So I didn't want to say that, Tyrannosaurus is just like a raven or a crow or a robin that you might see on the lawn. But if we look at both birds and crocodilians, those are the closest relatives of the extinct dinosaurs together. And if they share certain traits in common, we can be fairly certain that they're present in dinosaurs like T-Rex and Triceratops as well. So intelligence-wise, like, crocodilians are way smarter than we really ever gave them credit for. It's debated, but it's possible that some crocodiles and alligators might use tools, like they might use sticks to attract birds because they know the birds want those sticks for their nests, and they just chomp the bird when the bird comes down. Even beyond that, they show a great degree of parental care and sort of social complexity. So even though dinosaurs have often been portrayed as these only giant, lumbering, kind of not very smart, cold-blooded animals, I wanted to present the new dinosaurs. Basically, that these are animals that are very active. They are sort of very much a part of their environment in these interactions. They're not on autopilot. And in terms of their extinction and why they couldn't survive, a lot of it had to do with the fact that the effects of the impact that occurred, particularly, when you have this impactor strike, there's so much debris that gets thrown up into the atmosphere from the target rock that it hits, and also the impactor itself being pulverized. All that rock eventually comes back down. And it's kind of, if you think about science fiction or dramatizations of space travel where someone's coming back into the atmosphere and they're starting to heat up from all the friction on the outside of the ship as they're leaving space and coming into the atmosphere. Think about that happening on a small scale, with all these tiny specks of rock and debris. And any particular one isn't very much, but together, it's enough to create this infrared pulse, this incredible heat pulse that heats the atmosphere to about 500 degrees Fahrenheit. It's hot enough that forests, geologists speculate, probably burst spontaneously into flames, that you have basically spontaneous forest fires that got so hot. There's no life on Earth except maybe extremophile bacteria or something similar that could have avoided that amount of heat. So if you're a T-Rex or a Triceratops or an Ankylosaurus, what have you, there's no place for you to go unless you can get underwater or into a burrow underground where the heat is sort of dissipated by those layers above you. There's just no surviving it. And it wasn't just them. There were mass extinctions of mammals, mass extinctions of birds and snakes and lizards. Almost every group got hit. In the case of the non-avian dinosaurs, many of them were big, but some of them were small. And even those small ones that might have been able to get into a burrow or get underground then had to survive in 3 years of an ancient equivalent of what's basically an estimation of nuclear winter that's called an impact winter, that photosynthesis really slowed down, that the ecosystems collapsed. So if you're an animal that relies on, for example, if you're a little raptor that requires eating small mammals or smaller dinosaurs or lizards or snakes, and those things are pretty much gone, there's nothing to survive on. So there's all these different survival filters that came through because of the effects. And of course, the big ones are going to disappear, but even those small species that might have been able to hang on through that first 24 hours still faced a very hostile world over the course of years.
The thing that really affected me as I went further into the book was when you talked about, because the pH, the acidity or the alkalinity of the atmosphere changed dramatically. When you talk about that poor little guy and his shell has holes in it, and you're basically saying, yeah, he can hang on for a while, but he's not going to last and we're never going to see him again. That got to me because it's like, everything, everything changed.
Yeah, and that was important to the story, that the focus is on Hell Creek, but this is a global event. And I was worried that if I only talked about what happened to, our favorite dinosaurs of the Hell Creek ecosystem, that global picture would have been lost. And I really want to say this is happening all over the planet, and there are interesting things going on at many different places, whether it's the extinction of a particular species like the ammonite that you just mentioned, this little coil-shelled squid relative that's like trying to build its shell, but the ocean is too acidic. And we see this today in very acidic watery environments, that a lot of corals or shell building organisms, they can't build their bodies the way that they normally do, and that's a huge problem. So I wanted to say, look, yes, this happened in the past as well, but there are also stories of resurgence and revival, sort of the evolution of rodents, that you have very squirrel-like and rodent-like mammals called multituberculates that were probably the most successful group of mammals that's ever been. They've lasted far longer than almost any other group of mammals, even though many people don't know what they are. They mostly go extinct in Asia, and that gap allows the first rodents, the ancestors of today's squirrels and mice and rats and things, to evolve and start to proliferate. So there's all this sort of shifting around that occurs at different places all over the planet that we're starting to learn about. And I really wanted to drive that home, that we're kind of looking through a very refined window, but there are global consequences to it, both for good and for bad.
One of the things I always thought was funny when you talk about essentially evolution is I always thought it's funny, like with crocodiles and cockroaches, it's like evolution says, hey, you want us to give you a hand? And the crocodile goes, no, I'm fine. I'm good. Right? It's like, they just hang around. They don't really have to do anything. They're fine the way they are.
It's kind of interesting because there was a study that came out in the past year, and I went into this a little bit in the later chapters. I think I do a little profile on a caiman, this early or this surviving alligator relative in the early Paleocene world that's just kind of hanging out into this pond, saying that this form has been around for a very long time, but they're rapidly evolving into that space over and over again. There was a study on crocodiles recently that the idea that they're a living fossil is kind of an illusion, because all of those semi-aquatic, basically swamp puppies, those ambush predators that live in the water, it's not one consistent unbroken lineage through time, that these are many different groups of crocodilians that are repeatedly evolving the same look because it works. So there's a certain sort of niche that exists for something lurking at the water's edge that can burst out, and it's relatively flat and, you know, has a relatively slow metabolism. And crocodiles kind of keep rediscovering that over time. So they're actually evolving incredibly quickly. They're just kind of doing the same. It's evolution's greatest hit, basically, that they're doing it over and over again.
Groundhog Day. Oh,
yeah.
So it's funny you mentioned that study, because when I was researching for this, I saw there happened to be this new analysis of fish fossils by this lady named Melanie Durig of Uppsala University. Yeah, and so she basically says the same thing you're saying, that hibernation and being underwater is the way to go, was the way to go, or maybe being in the Southern Hemisphere.
Yeah, so that study is based on a site called the nicknamed Tanis that's in the Dakotas, and it might be from a very short time period after impact. I based some of the book on some of the early geological analysis of this site, so it's probably the closest we can get to seeing what transpired, at least in terms of the Hell Creek ecosystem, you know, in the hours or days following impact. And these fish, they're like modern paddlefish and sturgeon, but they have these little spherules, basically these little glass balls that were created by the heat and the pressure of the impact and then spread all over the planet in their gills. These were filter feeding fish. So as they're filter feeding through the water column, they end up picking up some of this debris and it becomes locked basically inside part of their bodies. So we know that was relatively close, on the order of like hours probably after impact. And it was really a matter of chance that, you know, no animal could really expect this. You know, maybe some creatures, as they notice, you know, the heat in the air starting to turn up, they could go underground and find an abandoned burrow or just kind of huddle there. But what really made the difference was this idea of almost not pre-adaptation, but it's really just luck. It's chance that if you're already living in a freshwater environment, or you already live in a way that, like, you build a burrow, you go underground, it's those creatures that have a much better chance of surviving, because when something is happening so quickly, there's no chance for evolution to act. It's basically just it's like a filter. It's basically filtering out, based upon those conditions, what species are going to survive and which are not. So it was really a matter of luck. And it's kind of interesting that there's another analysis by a paleontologist out of UC Berkeley named Pat Holroyd, who's been influential in this book as well, that freshwater species tend to survive for far longer than those on land. So just at the species level, in particular, not entire lineages, but specific animals that exist, that they last closer to about 10 million years, whereas animals on land, they only last for maybe 1 or 2 million years. So there's something about aquatic environments, about lakes and ponds and rivers and the creatures that live there, that they're able to enjoy this kind of stability that doesn't require a whole lot of change or turnover, in a sense, or at least what they do is successful for a very long amount of time, and that helps see them through this really intense period.
Yeah, and one of the things that, again, you brought home, because you used this simile of, you know, grass growing through the crack in a piece of concrete sidewalk. And I always think, when I used to live in Florida, that I kept telling everyone, don't plant any more bamboo, because you can't stop it. It'll grow through anything. And that really made me understand that it's really hard to kill everything.
Yeah, it's this idea, I quote it towards the end of the conclusion, you know, as oft used as it is at this point. I really love that Ian Malcolm line, you know, as portrayed by Jeff Goldblum in the 1993 movie adaptation of Jurassic Park, that life finds a way. That, you know, when we think about this is a, you know, a terrible event that occurred, but most of the book and most of the story is about recovery and about resilience. You know, the non-avian dinosaurs, so basically all the dinosaurs that weren't birds, because birds are the only surviving dinosaurs that we know about, that, they were shuffled off the stage relatively early. They're only there for about the first chapter or two. And then after that, it's this sort of post dinosaur dominated world where all these other creatures are coming through. But that's the thing, that there were seeds and nuts in the ground, that there were little mammals that could peek out of their burrows, that there were birds that were able to hide underground, and sort of ferns that were able to come up. And when you think about the fact that we've had 5 mass extinctions in the past, we're probably going through a 6th mass extinction now. All the same, since the time that life originated on Earth, about 3.5 billion years ago, there's always been life on Earth. Something has always survived, something has always come through. And after each of these major events, it really shakes things up. It kind of changes who's around and who's going to proliferate. It really strikes me, for example, that the whole reason that dinosaurs were able to, sort of begin their own great geologic age was because of mass extinction. Actually, 2 mass extinctions allowed them to do so. That it was our early ancestors and relatives, proto-mammals, prior to 252 million years ago, that were the most numerous and most influential vertebrates on the planet, at least on land. Then there was the worst mass extinction of all time, nicknamed the Great Dying. After that, reptiles took over, but it was other forms of reptiles. It was crocodile relatives that really proliferated first, and dinosaurs were kind of on the margins almost throughout the entire Triassic period. And it took another extinction at the end of the Triassic to remove a lot of that competition. And then dinosaurs really started to flourish. And then, the non-avian dinosaurs got taken out, and then mammals started to flourish. So there's this constant sort of back and forth over time, a sense of competition and opportunity that exists because of all these interactions that are constantly going on.
It's funny, you mentioned several times, and in the book almost exclusively, non-avian dinosaurs. Very careful.
Yes.
I mean, you do say birds once in a while, but
yes,
trying to get the point across to people, because people don't think of birds as dinosaurs. So why don't you explain why you say it that way? Are there birds that are not non-avian dinosaurs?
Yeah, so this is really a matter of history of science and sort of the history of how we name things and systematics and how we organize the tree of life. So we now know that birds are living dinosaurs, that the first birds go back to the Jurassic about 150 million years ago, and they're very much like a miniature version of Velociraptor. That the earliest birds, they're not something that's fundamentally different, that their ancestors were small carnivorous dinosaurs, and they were just another lineage of dinosaur that proliferated through the Jurassic and all through the Cretaceous, and they start taking on all these different sorts of forms. So if you were just to confine your understanding to the Mesozoic, to the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, birds would just seem like another form of dinosaur to you. But then the extinction happens, and it's only beaked birds that survive. There are actually many toothed birds that were around at the end of the Cretaceous, birds with teeth, as strange as that might be to think about, that went extinct because they had no food supply left. It was the birds with beaks that were able to feed on seeds and nuts in the ground that survive, and then began this proliferation of birds that we see around us today. So if you think about it from trying to organize nature and trying to understand who is related to whom, over the course of the past few centuries, birds seem so different from everything else, that they had feathers, they lacked teeth, that they have this complex system of air sacs in their bodies that allows their skeletons to be relatively light. They share so many traits together that are exclusive from those of mammals or reptiles or other forms of vertebrates around us. So we thought that they were their own group. And then it really took the discovery of a lot of very bird-like dinosaurs, particularly through the 1960s and 1970s, and their first feathered dinosaur fossils that showed up in the 1990s that really linked them together. The problem is that we've been using the word dinosaur for so long to mean something very discrete and say that they went entirely extinct, and now we're connecting them to birds. So how do you do that for a public audience without sort of creating a whole bunch of confusion? So that's how it's often sorted out, is that you have non-avian dinosaurs to basically mean all our favorites, the ones that dinosaurs in the classic sense. But dinosaurs as a whole group includes birds, and that's where we usually make that division. So it really has more to do with the natural history that we want to understand and how nature actually transpired. And then there's our attempt to understand it and put labels on it. And that's why we kind of have a relatively clunky term like non-avian dinosaurs, because there just isn't a great alternative yet without changing the entire system, basically.
Yeah. I've noticed throughout the interview how enthusiastic you are still about what you do. So let's talk a little bit about your
Yeah.
personal life. Well, like when you were a little kid, I mean, were you 2? Were you 3? How old were you when you started? And how come you stayed with it? I mean, my stepdaughter
Yeah.
knew every dinosaur when she was 3 and 4 years old, and then it all just dissipated, And my son,
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, is that it was sort of, there's a long fuse between the initial spark or inspiration and then the career that I created for myself. So when I was a little girl, I went through a couple of phases very quickly where apparently I liked trucks, and then I liked elephants, and then I liked dinosaurs. So apparently big and loud was really what fascinated me from a very early age. But it was visiting the American Museum of Natural History in New York City in about 1988. And this was before they did the big renovations that are in place today. So back then, the halls were relatively closed in, they're relatively dark, they're kind of gloomy. And I really loved that. It felt very dramatic. And at the time, there was a skeleton of what we were then calling Brontosaurus, with its tail on the ground. It has that boxy kind of skull full of spoon-shaped teeth. And I remember, I was just a kid. So to me, it was kind of almost like being a Mesozoic mammal, a mammal from the age of dinosaurs, looking up at this huge thing that was more than 60 feet long. And I remember thinking about, well, what did it look like? How did it move? What did it eat? What did the environment look like? I spent a lot of time thinking about, like, how did this dinosaur, like, did it make a sound when it breathed? Like, what would the sound of like dinosaur breathing be like? And that really set my fascination with these animals, being able to see the actual bones, not just in a book or through a toy model, but to see that these are real, tangible things that we're discovering. And that interest was maintained for a long time, but I was told by a lot of folks, like, I grew up in New Jersey, that you can't study paleontology if you live in New Jersey. We don't have dinosaurs here. That's entirely untrue. In some ways, paleontology started based in America, started because of fossil finds on the East Coast, including New Jersey. But I didn't know any better at the time. So it always kind of remained in the background as an interest, just a fascination, until I got to college. And I was not doing particularly well in my major. I always struggled with math. So I was a much better writer than I was a mathematician, and that was very difficult, some of the science I was trying to learn. So I would go to the computer lab at night, and I would use my institutional access to read scientific books and papers about fossils and dinosaurs. Like, I wanted to know what paleontologists were actually saying, not the sort of communicative report, not the sort of thing that basically I do now as a career. I wanted to go to the source material and understand more. And as I learned, I would write about it to help myself remember, and that helped me develop my writing skills. And that opened up this entirely different pathway. I actually dropped out of college 2 classes short of my bachelor's degree because my writing was taking off. I was like, okay, I can graduate with a C average, or I'm writing for Smithsonian. My first book is going to come out. Maybe I'll go on this direction. And that's what has really allowed me to engage with this so much. And I do go out in the field over the past 10 years, from my home in Salt Lake City. I go out into the field every summer with different museum and university crews looking for new fossils, not just dinosaurs, but all sorts of fossil organisms. And it was really this alternate pathway that opened up just through fascination, finding an outlet, finding a way to join the conversation about it.
I'm not saying this in a bad way, but it seems
Yeah.
like you'd rather hang out with dinosaurs than people. If you
Sometimes, yeah. It's really a wonderful feeling, to tell you the truth. So this, it's not a time period that's directly covered in the last days of the dinosaurs, but one of my favorite field experiences that I ever had. And I hope to go back this year. But last year in July, there is a paleontological investigation called the Uinta Basin Paleo Project. So it's based in eastern Utah. It's near the Colorado border, and it's looking at a time period called the Eocene, or translates to the dawn of the recent. So this is where the age of mammals is really kicking off. It's about 15 million years after the impact. And it's just a gorgeous place. The Badlands, there's not a whole lot of vegetation. You get to see the rock layers all laid out in front of you in these rainbow colors. They're maroon and yellow and gray, and it's just absolutely stunning. And every morning we get up before sunrise because it gets incredibly hot in the middle of the day, and we drive out to the outcrop that we want to look at to go look for fossils, and just hop out of the truck, make sure you have your water and your sunscreen, and you just walk. And most of the time I'd be by myself, or at least within shouting distance if there's a rattlesnake or something like that of folks who are nearby, or my colleagues. But it really becomes sort of a meditative space, that you're walking on the remains of an environment that was fundamentally different during the time that was alive, that basically the time that plants and animals and other organisms were living there, looking for traces of it. So you have this desert that's basically growing out of the past. And as I like to say, sometimes it's good to be in a place where I don't necessarily have self-service or other things going on. It's a place where I can think my thoughts and feel my feelings without constant interference from email or social media. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. I really look forward to going back. It's something that you can really get in touch with, not just yourself, but who you are in relation to a lot of these deep time settings and stories.
Yeah, it reminded me just now of like when I was a kid, which was way longer ago than you were a kid, and we had these really heavy plastic, they're like solid brontosaurus and T-Rexes. I remember I was like little tiny. I was taking a bath with my brother, and I remember hitting him over the head with the thing, like hitting him with a hammer. And it was very convenient. You can call it was convenient because you could grab the tail, and you essentially had a striking tool. And it wasn't a brontosaurus like whatever you would call it today, but it was yeah. And the other thing I saw with brontosaurus was when I was little, they had Sinclair Gas, which they don't have anymore, and their logo is basically a brontosaurus, and I couldn't figure that out. I couldn't figure out, wait a minute, why is this connected to this?
Yeah, Sinclair is still around. It's out here in the West, at least. I was kind of surprised. I moved from New Jersey to Utah. I started noticing Sinclair stations. I was very excited because I thought that was really cool that they still have, the sauropod dinosaur as their logo. And that, from what I understand, principally came about because during the early 20th century, early 1900s, there was the discovery of a massive bone bed of Jurassic dinosaurs, including many of these long-necked dinosaurs like Diplodocus and Apatosaurus near Shell, Wyoming, which is very close to where I think Sinclair has a refinery or some major location for their business. And they kind of helped sponsor some of this excavation. They ended up taking the sauropod dinosaur as their logo and just kind of running with that. There were a lot of World's Fairs when that used to be run, that they put up these big dinosaur exhibits, and it kind of created the myth that gasoline is like created from dinosaur bones. It's actually not. Oil and petroleum come from very different fossil sources, but it certainly has worked for them from a branding perspective.
Yeah, so the other thing that's funny is it goes on and on and on. I don't know why kids immediately attach themselves to this. And like I was we were having a conference, but I went to Disney Springs, and they have like the Rainforest Restaurant Cafe. It has this big volcano. We didn't talk about the volcanoes, but big volcano, and then inside is just dinosaurs, and kids love going there. It's just, and there's the other one is I think it's actually called T-Rex, but why is it? I don't get it. Why? Like you said about trucks, or my nephews all loved, skid loaders and bulldozers and front end loaders, same kind of thing, big, boxy, loud. But what is it? There's something evanescent about it. It's something mythological, or something about why. How does a child of 2 or 3 feel as if this becomes the most important thing in their life for that period?
Yeah, it's difficult to tease out. There's certainly been a lot of ideas. One of the ideas is that dinosaurs are sort of, at least in our imaginations, they're big and they're loud and they're fierce, but they're also safe. So parents feel, safer, sort of like giving their kid an interest in dinosaurs and something else, because dinosaurs are extinct. They can't possibly hurt anybody at this point. I think I know 1 or 2 people might have cut themselves on like a dinosaur tooth while excavating, but that's about as bad as it gets. The thing is, it's a relatively new phenomenon. Part of what I believe about this is that dinosaurs have become popular because they are popular, and they've so saturated our landscape that from the time that you're born, maybe even before, there's all kinds of branded merchandise and clothing and things with dinosaurs on them. And it's become part of our culture that you're expected to go through a dinosaur phase. And we kind of, it's an introduction to so many aspects of science, because when you look at a dinosaur, like all these fundamental questions pour out of, what is that, and when did it live, and what did it eat, and why is it here? So you start to get at these really big picture questions very early on in your life when you start to encounter dinosaurs about, okay, this is a really big animal that's not around anymore. So okay, one, extinction is real, and time has gone on for a very long time, that there's a history of the world and the planet that goes back far deeper than we'd otherwise comprehend that's embodied by dinosaurs. The dinosaurs changed over that time period, so that evolution is a reality. So just by itself, those three major pillars really of paleontology and geology, even science in general, evolution, extinction, and deep time embodied by these animals and all the questions that spill out of it. And it requires imagination to answer. That's one of the things I love about this, is that so many of the things in this book, I write a narrative, but then I have an appendix where I sort of show my work. So where am I getting this information from? What is speculative? What's based in actual scientific research? But through all of that, there are certain things about dinosaurs that are either speculative or experts disagree about. For example, even just something like, what did the heart of a T-Rex look like? We don't know that because we don't have that fossil, but we know they must have had one because they're vertebrates. So it requires a sense of deduction and imagination to really bring them to life. And where this all started, I think, historians of science are still working on. There are time periods where fossils and dinosaurs were thought to be not appropriate for children. There's a great cartoon from the late 19th century from an English magazine called Punch that shows basically a caregiver taking a small child who's crying through this prehistoric gallery of animals that were put up at the Crystal Palace in London. And the kid is just bawling their eyes out. And it was supposed to be this metaphor for how like the upper classes were trying to tell the lower classes, what they should be interested in, find fascinating, and that, we know what's best to improve your mind. And there wasn't dinomania then. Dinomania as we know it today really only popped up in the 1980s and beyond. The dinosaurs were present before that, but there wasn't this sort of merchandising and popularity around them that is now. So now it's kind of, it's become a dinosaur in and of itself. It's this big, ever-present kind of unstoppable thing. But there is that draw, and I think a lot of it is the fact that it requires us to imagine what they were like, that we're never going to have 100% of the answers, that we have to think and speculate and kind of get that visual picture of what these animals mean to us, and that kind of makes them special.
Yeah, and the other thing is when you're old enough to recognize size and scale, like you with elephants, you think of the blue whale, you think of an elephant, and then you think of a creature that's 1/3 or more of a football field. Mm-hmm. It's like, I think that's another thing that kids get off on. I mean, how?
Yeah. It's something that I think about it when I visit museums even now, because when you observe people, if you just stand in a fossil gallery, if you go to whatever natural history museum that has a fossil exhibit, if you watch the adults moving through exhibits, they often, if they're not looking at their phones, they're often just like kind of walking and looking at everything from their head height, from how they stand. But when you're a kid, you're not only much smaller, you're not only much shorter, but I feel like there's more of a sense of like, oh, I want to look around the corner. I want to get this different perspective on it. And everything seems so different and so much bigger because you have this different perspective. So I like when I go through fossil exhibits to kind of crouch down a little bit, or even sit on the floor, or kind of look around a corner and get different perspectives on these animals. Because when you think, it might only be, you're looking at an animal that's 80 feet long, and it might only be about 3 feet of like head difference from when you were little versus you now. But those 3 feet make a huge difference in how we perceive these things and how big they seem. It's almost like looking at life through like a fisheye lens, where everything seems like a bit bigger and a bit more dramatic. And we can still get to it, it's just we have to remember to do it.
Yeah, it's like me remembering sledding down a hill that I thought was gigantic and then going back to it, and it's just like this little mound.
Yes.
The other thing is, I love sitting on the floor in museums. The only problem now is I'm so old I can't get up without someone else being there and grabbing my hand like in a football game.
Yeah.
Well, so in the appendix, and I wouldn't bring this up other than the fact that you do, and you kind of do it as an allegory. Talk a little bit about your own personal journey over the past few years.
Yeah. So, oh, of course. I mean, I put it in the book. This is something that I feel like is important. I love talking about. So I came up with this idea. I was really fascinated by this particular extinction because I knew that even in my own writing, I was kind of guilty of doing the yada yada version of the Cretaceous extinction. That, I say, there were dinosaurs, and then there was this impact, and then the world changed. And I didn't really unpack what that was. And the more that I started to report on this, and the more research I did on it, the more I was shocked by how quickly it happened, how many unexpected events transpired through all of this. So I was already kind of set on it. And then around the time that like I was thinking about, well, what's my next book going to be? I came out as transgender, and I set about starting my transition. I got a divorce from a marriage that I was in for 15 years. So for me, it was very much this powerful, as you say, allegory of life is kind of going along as you always expected. And then on just one particular pivotal day, really, it flips and it becomes fundamentally different. You find yourself kind of careening along this other pathway that for me was very much about growth and resilience and kind of growing out of was what really a traumatic time for me during that initial year following the divorce and coming out, that I still had hope that there are these little seeds of things I knew were there. Like I wanted to see them come up and I wanted to see the growth that would happen. So the fact that this extinction happened so rapidly, so unexpectedly, and it matched what some of my personal experience was, also in the sense of the world being a particular way, but we're opening up into something new, something different, something that we're not entirely sure what it's going to look like at the end result. It really resonated pretty powerfully with me, and that's my own version of it, but I'm sure there are plenty of other circumstances that people have gone through where life is going along in a certain way. And as I said, I think it's the first line of the book, that catastrophe is never convenient. We don't expect these things. We don't expect these changes, and how rapid they can sometimes be and how fundamentally they can change us. So I really wanted to drive home that this isn't just like the story of a particular geologic event, but it's a reminder of how resilient life is, how responsive it can be. And as much as we might miss a particular time or era, that the ending of that is not necessarily bad. Sometimes it allows something new to grow in its place. And for myself, I really resonated with that.
Yeah, and you're right. It's not on your part or my part. It's not impulsivity. I don't even think it's like a Malcolm Gladwell tipping point. It's just something. It's just something happens. And it's not, in this case, a catastrophe, but it's just like, you can't predict it. You can't say, it's like that movie Sliding Doors or something like that. You just can't say in advance what it's going to be. It could be a phone call. It could be someone saying a word to you or saying something, I didn't know you were something. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I am something, that kind of thing. And yeah, it's maybe straining the allegory slightly, but I think for the most part, that's the way things work. And I think what's good about what you've done, both in the book and in your life, is that, takes courage. It's like, if you're afraid of stepping over a curb, then you won't step over it, but it's just a curb. So once you stop being afraid, then you can step over the curb, no big deal then.
Yeah, I think it's still relevant, just in my own personal experience, like things are still very difficult for transgender people now.
You talk about that in the book, about people treated you differently, and that one guy with the shotgun he had was suggesting that the homophobic guy.
That you encounter plenty of opposition, whether it's personal or whether at the government level or what have you. But that's why I really want to tell a story of growth and resilience, that there is, even during those darkest years of the earliest part of the Paleocene, that life was still coming back. It was still growing. It was still moving towards something that was really vibrant and really beautiful. So I found a lot of hope in that I didn't want this to be a story principally of loss, even though there is a sense of loss and grief to it. But it's really about like, well, what does life do? How does it respond? How does it come back? How does it rebuild itself, but also do something different? And I think just keeping it that simple, really, I know that I certainly connect to it, and I know a few other readers have as well, especially coming out of we're not out of it, still dealing with the pandemic, and as life has changed, now it fundamentally changed everybody's life over a couple of years, and now we're kind of emerging into this uncertain territory, but we still want to hope for all these wonderful things.
Yeah, when you say make it simple, and you kind of you talk about it, it's basically life doesn't want to stop. It wants to keep going. It just wants it more than it has to want it more than anything. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking today.
Yeah, and it's just what it does. That life is, it's built into it. That life is incredibly responsive. That you change something, there is still loss, even outside of a mass extinction. 99.9% of every species that ever existed is extinct, that we are kind of just living with the descendants and the survivors of 3.5 billion years of history. And we can look at that in a negative sense about how much has been lost and sort of the memento mori of like the inevitability of extinction. Or we can look at it's like, how amazing is that there's this unbroken connection, that there's always been something else, that life has always found a way to be responsive and do something different, and that's built into what it is. And I think that's wonderful.
Well, as we close, and now going back to the book, not talking about you anymore, or talking about the book, because that's
Yes.
Do you have a copy that you can hold up?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do. Yeah. So this, I haven't gotten the finished ones yet, but it'll have the same basic cover on it. So this is it. I really love that difference between the sort of dinosaur in life and the skeletonized version.
Yeah, it's a great cover because it goes back to what you were doing. And I'll end with this, is like, the reason why this book is so good, The Last Days of the Dinosaurs by Riley Black, is because the cover pretty much explains what she's done, which is taken this one moment and everything's fine. And basically just everything is not fine anymore. And then she goes on from there. So thank you so much, Riley, for being with us today. It was great talking to you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really been nice to be here.
Okay. Talk to you soon, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.